So here we are in Western Heritage Chapter 10, talking about the Renaissance and an age of discovery. So what we're going to do is address some of the big questions. The first big question we have to ask ourselves is, what is a Renaissance, right? If you're going to define or describe it. And a Renaissance, the word literally means reborn. Nacer, if you're familiar, for example, with Spanish, which has a Latin base, nacer is to be born. So to be reborn. Here's some technical definitions, and you can find these in your textbook, all over websites. But from technically speaking, one example would be the humanistic revival of classical art, architecture, literature, and learning that originated in Italy in the 14th century and later spread throughout Europe. Another definition I found was the period of this revival, roughly the 14th through the 16th century, marking the transition from medieval to modern times. Another is marked changes in art, architecture, literature, and education, or a period of revival of the classics, or as you may have already read in Wells' History of the Faith, Chapter 6, he calls it a period of rebellion against authority. So it's a rebirth of something, and something is going to be reborn. There's assumption there that there was something existing before that we're going back to. And this is where we're going to talk about the classics. We're not saying this is something brand new. This is something that's reborn. This is something that's redone. Some other questions we'll discuss briefly here. How does this rebirth compare or contrast with the medieval period? Do a little bit of comparison between the Italian and the Northern Renaissances. I think it's important to distinguish the two. Talk about what humanism is, Renaissance humanism, and how did and should Christians potentially respond to it, and finally, what impact did the Age of Exploration have on Western worldviews? One of the reasons, right, that this is a new period in some ways, new opportunity. So the Renaissance, as we said, began in Italy, and the factors that contributed to it, what set Italy up for a new age, some would say a rebirth, right, or coming out of a darkened time like the Middle Ages or medieval or dark period. Italy was starting to develop some sense of political centralization, separation from Germany, and people were, although we're going to talk about divided, there was some sense of Italian nationalism, especially as connected to the Catholic Church. But I'd say more importantly is that they had strong urban or city economies, a very strong merchant class in some of those cities, and money available. And so if you want a rebirth of learning, a rebirth of knowledge, if you want to have time to hire somebody to paint, somebody to make a sculpture, or to build huge cathedrals, you better have money available. And the merchant class, as it was growing, was providing that. I mean, because of that, and you probably remember from your novel In the Shadow of the Cathedral, there's an increase or growth in secular cultures because of all this wealth and money that's coming through, or at least partially due to that. And then also, there's a lot of autonomy. I said again, there's a national sense of unity, but there's increased autonomy in the Italian city-states. And we'll talk about what those are in just a second. These Italian city-states, right? For example, Milan, Florence, Venice, the Papal States, where the Pope, right, had his headquarters, Naples and Genoa. That's among a few. And each of these individual city-states had significant individual wealth. Like the city-states of the Greeks or the early Roman city-states, they were operating on their own. In fact, they were in competition with one another. The reason, right, that they could be so wealthy is because Italy is in a very prime location for trade, right? So each of these cities would be on or near, right, the coast, and would be able to trade all over the known world at the time. Why was there not greater Italian unity? Why didn't they, like France and England, that were starting to kind of come together and to be really nationalistic? Why wasn't that happening in Italy? Well, one of the reasons was that the kings or the various nobles clashed often with the Pope, right? If the Pope is living in the Papal States, do the nobles of Milan and Naples, of Venice, for example, do they feel okay with the Pope having control over them, or are they going to try to exercise their own secular rule? So that was one factor. And the other is that as the city-states are competing with one another, that prevents them from actually unifying, as they're all trying to get the upper hand in trade, right? Famous from Florence, Cosimo de' Medici, a very wealthy family, founded one of the academies there, and again, an example of autonomy in the city-states. Right, and there you go. There would be an example of, just on the map there, you can see some of the different regions, or, the little basically feudal kingdoms that were still there and controlled by various cities. So humanism, right? We hear about this term Renaissance humanism, and often, right, humanism is sort of a buzzword today, in which, right, we tend to think that it's this unchristian philosophy emphasizing human dignity, individuals, and secular values. In other words, if you're a humanist, you focus on man rather than on God. But in reality, by technical definition, a humanist is someone who studies the humanitas, or studies the humanities. Right? At Emmaus, we study the humanities. We study English. We study history. We study rhetoric. We study law. We study, I think I said literature. Um, we do that. Does that make us humanists? Well, technically speaking, yes. But not necessarily in the way the word humanism has evolved and changed today, right? So we tend to think about it, it's this unchristian philosophy. When in reality, it was a period of championing the studies of Latin, Greek classics, and the writings of the early church fathers as a guide for reforming society, which we probably, hopefully, don't object to that. Right, so let's compare that. Last chapter we talked about the scholastic movement, and we said that the scholastics would kind of read the classics and kind of summarize and reconcile the views of respected scholars. So they would say, what did so and so say about what Augustine said, or what did so and so say about what Paul said, and let's try to reckon their views. Whereas the Renaissance is kind of a rebirth and interest in getting back to the humanities, to the classics, in which they would say, let's not say what did, for example, Peter Abelard, what did he have to say about Augustine? They would say, let's read Augustine and see what Augustine has to say for himself. So a heavy emphasis on going back to and identifying with ancient sources. Right? The father of humanism is a guy named Petrarch, and I'm just putting it out there because it'll probably be a quiz question. Right? He famously wrote things, for example, like imaginary dialogues with the past. So he would say, if I was talking to Augustine of Hippo based on his writings, here's how the dialogue might go. And you could kind of almost have this conversation with the past. That'd be a good example of Renaissance humanist literature. So right, it's interesting, and we can't talk about the Renaissance without mentioning art and various artists. We won't talk about all of them, but overall there's a heavy emphasis on three-dimensional painting, very realistic and kind of intended to provoke emotions, as compared to kind of the more two-dimensional art that you would see in the Middle Ages or in the medieval period, right? And again, when we talk about a rebirth, we're going back to what the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans did, right? They're more realistic three-dimensional sculptures and paintings, and then there's kind of a period of change in the Middle Ages, and then we're kind of reviving that. Giotto is known as the father of Renaissance painting. You guys have heard of Donatello, right? Da Vinci, and again Raphael, Michelangelo, and others. You're familiar if you're familiar with the Ninja Turtles. The names will at least be relevant to you. And one thing that's interesting to note is that these weren't, right, just painters, right? Guys like Leonardo da Vinci, who are on the one hand famous for the Mona Lisa. He was a military engineer, an airplane designer, right? He kind of came up with a prototype of what that could look like. He was a botanist. He did human dissection, which was fairly controversial in the day. So again, a man of many skills. Right, just some examples of, right, the kind of Middle Ages two-dimensional painting, right, and who's to say that that's bad art, right? It's not that it necessarily was a move backwards. I'm not much of an artist, and I probably couldn't paint anything like that, but a lot of people felt that we want to get back to a more classic, realistic look. So, right, we get a lot of paintings of the Christ child and the Madonna, right, the mother of Jesus Mary, some examples of sculptures and paintings. All right, and here's some of Da Vinci's works, right? A handful of his own. So again, a much more realistic style. So, right, these are things that are going on mainly in Italy, a few other places, but the politics in Italy starts to decline, right? Partially because of conflict between the city-states. They're not fully united, which means that when an enemy comes, they are divided. A house divided itself cannot stand. All right, so you get some foreign invasions and some various alliances against them. They're also dealing with the French church, right? And we've already heard about the Avignon papacy. But the French church is also a very powerful Catholic group that is nationalized, right? After the 100 Years' Wars, they're kind of coming together. The Italians haven't done so. And so the Italians are fairly weak compared to the French competition. It's interesting, one writer-author named is Niccolo Machiavelli he wrote the book The Prince, right? And it's available, and a lot of people read it in literature classes today. And his basic theory was this, that the ends justifies the means. And he had a very specific reason for arguing that, right? In The Prince, he essentially said that he wanted Italy to be united and one strong, powerful nation. He wanted it. That was the ends. That was what he said would be the greatest thing for Italy. But he recognized that for that to happen, it would probably require a dictator, someone to literally come in and conquer, to take over Italy, and then force them to be united, right? And so he said the means of getting there won't be pleasant, but in his logic, the end, the goal of unity, was worth the means, the conflict it would take to get there. So an interesting theory to kind of ponder and question. Do you think it's true? Is it always true? Are there some exceptions? Right? But in 1527, right, Rome is actually sacked by Charles V, and we'll talk about him more in chapter 7, because he's the emperor when Martin Luther, or becomes emperor when Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses to the wall, to the door of Wittenberg. But in 1527, he sacks Rome, and that, some people say, is kind of the end of the Italian Renaissance or rebirth period. Moving on, though, right, there's a revival of monarchy or kings up in northern Europe and in the West, right? So you get France, right, who consolidated and was very powerful after the 100-Year War. And they're at the same time distracted because they're coming into conflict with the Italians and the Pope there. Spain, which we haven't talked a whole lot about, they're interesting. They have this one particular rich and wealthy noble family, the Borgias, who were so notoriously corrupt. There was inbreeding. There was a lot of simony, buying of church offices. In fact, they even had some connections with getting popes elected. So really quite a political mess there. But they were also very powerful, and some famous Spaniards are King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, right? The ones who are going to hire Christopher Columbus to try to find a way to the Indies, and instead he discovers the Americas. Under them, they kind of consolidate. They kind of bring Spain together in a kind of a strong political and religious Catholic kind of unified nation. They're, again, like I said, responsible for exploring parts of the New World. They also kind of really push for a member of the Inquisition, which was kind of founded and established by Innocent III back a couple of centuries before. But they are the ones who really try to root out any kind of heresy, any kind of questioning of the Catholic Church. And the Spanish Inquisition is probably the most famous one, famous often for torturing people into getting them to make confessions. Right, and then they were also involved because their daughter, Catherine of Aragon, ends up in some political marriages very much connected to the English monarch, Henry VIII, and that's a mess we'll talk about in another chapter. Right, but Spain, interestingly, again, just for context, they dominate the 16th century in Europe. So in the 1500s, Spain is actually the most powerful nation, most powerful country in Europe. Now, northern monarchies continued, right? We get England, who after the 100-Year War has their own civil war at home between two wealthy families, the House of York and the House of Lancaster. Henry VII of the House of Lancaster technically wins that, but then marries, right, one of the daughters of the House of York, the King of York, and sets up or begins what is known as the Tudor dynasty. And we'll talk about Henry VIII and then, right, Elizabeth and others afterwards, one of the famous English families. Right, Germany and Italy, right, technically they're not even calling themselves Germany and Italy so much as the Holy Roman Empire, and they're sort of still the exception to unity because they're unified, but the kings, the monarchs, for example, Charles V, were doing a lot more reigning, right, technically they're the king, but not a lot of ruling. Their actual political power and influence was very much in check under the popes, very much in check under the church, and under, for example, the different princes and nobles scattered throughout Germany and Italy. So the Northern Renaissance, right, what kind of caused the rebirth of learning and thinking and writing up there? Well, the major invention in 1439 was the printing press. And not just that we could print things, but Johann Gutenberg, very importantly, invented movable type, right? And so we could, kind of like making a newspaper today, move the words, the letters around to quickly make copies compared to handwriting as every individual word and copy as had been done in the past.
right? And which it's great, a huge opportunity for knowledge, right? To spread, for example, God's word and good teaching and theology. But it's also, right, there's always the drawback of the more you can write and the more you can say, and the more potential there is, the more information there is, the more potential for misinformation there is. So always be careful. Right, Erasmus of Rotterdam was another important, some would call him a pre-reformer, early reformer, but a humanist, if you will. He's famous for saying famous adages like "leave no stone unturned." In other words, search thoroughly. And he was very simple, right? He's remained a Catholic his whole life, but emphasized simple, ethical piety. He revised the Latin Vulgate. He did basically read through it, and he said Jerome's old copy is not the best interpretation. So he goes back to the original text and revises the Latin version of the scriptures. And some people call him an early reformer, although technically he'll never fully identify with the Reformation. But he was asking a lot of questions, and as a humanist, again, was studying the classics and saying we need to get back to the originals. Right? He famously wrote the Philosophia Christi, or the Philosophy of Christ, which there are even Protestants who use that today in trying to understand and better know the teachings and person and works of Christ. So humanism and reform, what's the connection between it all as we're moving towards the next chapter on the Reformation? Well, Martin Luther's mentor, Reuchlin from Germany, kind of considered himself in many ways a humanist. Again, he pushed Luther to go back to and look at the classics, which is what he did, and looked at the scriptures themselves instead of the interpretations of the scriptures, and he realized that some didn't make quite enough sense. Right, in England, right, you get Thomas More, who's been mentioned in a couple of your textbooks, who wrote the book Utopia, which is interesting, right? So the word utopia, or atopia, basically means or no, and topia, or topos, or no place. So either he was saying this is a place that doesn't exist, so we need to create it, right, this perfect place to live, or he was saying it doesn't exist at all. In fact, maybe it never will. So you could take that two ways. He was actually eventually executed by Henry VIII for not agreeing to his getting a divorce. But again, a humanist. He's writing about, reads the classics and writing about the world and trying to make sense of it. In France, right, John Calvinist, interestingly, he called himself, and others referred to him as a young, reform-minded French humanist, right? And as Christians today, in our contemporary use of language, we may get uncomfortable with the use of calling a more famous reformer a humanist, but what he was doing was going back to and reading and looking at the classics. Right, in Spain, here's an interesting one. A guy named Francisco Jimenez de Cisneros, on the one hand, was an inquisitor. He's a famous Spanish monk who ran the Inquisition, right? Who actually was involved in rooting out heretics, and in some ways we would disagree. But he also, as a humanist, studied the Bible and actually produced the Complutensian Polyglot Bible, which was basically side-by-side versions or parallel versions, maybe like we use today, with multiple languages. So you could look at the scriptures in their originals in the text side by side. So again, on the one hand, we may disagree with his involvement in the Inquisition, but God at the same time uses him to help us to better understand and be able to study the scriptures. So as a kind of a last little point here before we kind of briefly review, when we're thinking about all these things that are going on, right, that there's these rediscoveries of learning, it's going back to the classics, there's new types of art, we've got the printing press. In the midst of all of this, and some nations are consolidating their power, some are splitting up and becoming weaker, like the Holy Roman Empire. But in the midst of this, the New World is discovered, the Americas are discovered, and it's going to have an impact. First of all, right, the impact is on the New World itself is that the Europeans exploit through mines, plantations, and slaves, etc. The world becomes a lot more connected, and we take advantage. And Europe becomes very wealthy in some senses from what they gain in their colonies in the New World. The indigenous populations decreased in the New World, right? And on the flip side of it, there was a monk, Spanish monk, Bartolomé de las Casas, that he actually argued that the Spanish were the uncivilized ones and that they were very much the ones that were at fault for the deaths of all the indigenous. Ran kind of contrary. He was very influential, but ran contrary to what the Europeans wanted to think of themselves. The New World was also a new ground for ideological experimentation. What does it mean to be a Westerner? What does it mean to be Catholic? What does it mean to have the best possible world or society, like Thomas More was writing about? And the New World is a place where people thought, hey, maybe we can try something new, right? And the whole world, right, where it was impacted by trade items in what is called the Columbian Exchange, right? So again, Columbus and the Europeans bring, for example, horses to the New World. So again, when you see Native Americans who are riding horses on the Great Plains and say, wow, that's really cool. They've been doing that for centuries and millennia. They haven't. They've only been doing it since horses were introduced in the 1500s. The impact on Europe, on the flip side, right? A ton of wealth was brought back, especially for the Spanish, right? The world economies were inflated. There's increased social division, right? As more wealth comes into play, and the greater the spread, so you're going to get nobles, wealthy merchants. You're going to have more social classes created. The Crusader mentality was continued, right? So in the last unit, you had to ask yourself, well, should we continue to talk about the Crusades? We apologize for them. The New World, in many senses, became the land of opportunity, especially for the Spanish in Central and South America. They've already been killing the Muslims and the Moors at home, and it was normal. It made sense for them to then kill the pagans if they didn't convert in the New World, right? And the power of the church also was going to grow significantly because of the wealth that was coming in from these different explorations and discoveries. So again, reviewing, we talked about the Renaissance and the different definitions. It's a period of rebirth, 14th to the 16th century. And I think it's going to be important for us to keep in mind that this is maybe the good word for it is a transition period. That there is change, but there's also right a lot of similarities, and things don't change just rapidly overnight. We looked at these other questions. So what impact does it all have on the Western worldview? Well, we're going to talk about its connection to the Reformation when we look at chapter 7. Till then, take care.